Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Baku American Center virtual program again. We're delighted to begin this evening our week-long entrepreneurship program. We are for this week and into next week as well going to be looking at the entrepreneurship sector. As most of you know, every June, this June notwithstanding, we at the U.S. State Department host the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, at which we celebrate entrepreneurship. We talk about the role it's played in the development of the U.S. economy, and we examine it. We see how it works, what makes for a successful entrepreneur, what are some techniques we might not want to try. And we are delighted to begin the series tonight with a session led by Gary Shenegar, who is an internationally recognized thought leader in the field of entrepreneurial mindset education. Gary, who is the founder of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative, has influenced a broad audience of higher education and economic development organizations, as well as individuals and institutions coming from the government, corporate, and nonprofit sector. He has worked extensively with U.S. State Department, so we are delighted to welcome him back tonight for a session in which he is going to talk about the mindset of the entrepreneur and what makes a successful entrepreneur. Moderating this evening's discussion is the head of the U.S. Embassy to Baku's Economic Affairs section, Justin Berg. Justin is a longstanding economic coned officer who has served throughout mostly Europe, but also Latin America. And again, he is going to moderate this evening's session. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce Gary Shenegar and Economic Section Chief Justin Berg. Thank you. Thank you both. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. And Gary, thank you so much for coming all the way to Baku. I think it's great that you've been here before, so you can imagine Baku and the restaurants and how wonderful it is. This is the place that is just waking up from a bit of a coronavirus-related shutdown. And I know that a lot of folks have a lot of interest in what you're going to deliver today on entrepreneurship. And on how you start and run successfully your own business. For those that are tuning in, we welcome comments and suggestions. I have a full set of questions for Gary, but it's going to be a lot more interesting if I'm asking your questions, not my questions. So please use the chat feature, and we will forward those questions off to Gary. I think that we'll start with a short presentation and then have a little bit of question and answer period. Gary, it's over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Justin. Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today. I'm really, really excited to be back in Baku, so to speak, virtually. I very much enjoyed my last visit there and made a lot of great friends. So thank you for joining me. So for about the last 30 years, I've been trying to figure out what makes entrepreneurs tick. And what I mean by that is I've been trying to sort of deconstruct the underlying logic that drives the behavior. And I've not really been interested in all the big name entrepreneurs, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, or whatever. I'm more interested in the underdog entrepreneurs. And what I mean by that are people that start with little or nothing. The people that don't have, a Stanford MBA, they don't have access to venture capital, they don't have millions of dollars in the bank, they don't maybe have a genius IQ. I wanted to understand how ordinary people manage to recognize, evaluate, and bring new ideas to life. And so that set me on this journey to try to figure this out. And my thought was that if I could somehow deconstruct the mindset of these these everyday entrepreneurs, that this could be useful to other people. And it can be useful not only for people that want to start a business, but it can be useful for anyone who wants to create more meaning and more prosperity in their own lives. And so that's kind of the backstory about where I came from and what I'm trying to do here. What I've done is I spent the last 30 years like observing and analyzing the behavior of these underdog entrepreneurs. I've traveled all over the world. I've interviewed about 500 entrepreneurs from from Moscow to Buenos Aires to South Africa, Europe, all over North America. And I've gleaned some concepts that I wanted to share with you all today that I hope you'll find useful. These are, what I did is I went looking for the concepts that were replicable, right? They were common and replicable features of their stories. So if someone said, well, my father gave me $1 million, well, I'm not really interested in that story because we can't replicate that. If someone has, a genius IQ, they have an IQ of 160 and they're, tinkering in a laboratory somewhere at Harvard or Stanford, I can't really replicate that. So what I'm going to talk about today are 8 common and replicable factors that I've gleaned from hundreds of interviews. But before I do that, I want to sort of introduce you to 2 fundamental concepts. So if you'll bear with me here for a second, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll jump right in. There we go. Okay. So, the general idea here is what makes an entrepreneur. Like, a lot of people hear the word entrepreneur and they think of, oh, you got to be born with these. There's somehow magical abilities that you have, that this rare personality traits. And I'm going to try to, demystify all of that. And one of the challenges that we face is that, what is the word entrepreneur causes us to think of things that are maybe out of reach, right? And simply put, it's our ability to really understand and embrace it is often limited by the way in which we define it, right? And so we hear the word entrepreneur, we think about the Mark Zuckerbergs or the Elon Musks of this world, and for most of us, that's just too far out of reach. But not only that, these examples of entrepreneurs, they skew our thinking not only about how to be an entrepreneur, but about who can be an entrepreneur. And so what I wanted to start with is a simple definition of entrepreneurship. And I'm going to just define it as an opportunity discovery process, right? So now, to contradict myself, I'm going to quote Elon Musk, right? He uses this term called first principles, which is, let's break this down to its most basic idea, right? As human beings, we survive by making ourselves useful to other human beings, right? That's the basic fundamental building block of entrepreneurship. And if you get that right, like your chances of success are exponentially increased, right? So we think about the entrepreneurial process as an opportunity discovery process, right? It's about discovery, but we're looking for ways to make ourselves useful to other humans. Now, that might sound overly simple, right? Well, it does, and it is. It's deceptively simple, but most of us have been educated in a way that tells us that we're going to work for someone else, that we're going to work within an established organization where the useful thing has already been determined. And we're going to fulfill a useful role within that organization, but that useful role has also already been determined, right? So our ability to be useful to other humans is constrained by these factors, right? We're going to exchange our knowledge and skill with an employer for a salary or a wage. And it's a little bit different than the way entrepreneurs think. So without getting too far off in the weeds, I want to just begin with this idea. Entrepreneurship is an opportunity discovery process. and it requires opportunity discovery skills. That's the main point here. So the second thing I want to start with is talking about what is a mindset, right? We use this word freely without really understanding what a mindset is and how it works. So I want to talk about that just for a minute or two, right? So we all have a mindset, yet very few of us are aware of it, much less the ways in which our mindset influences our behavior without our awareness, right? So here's how a mindset works, right? Our brains are inundated with data. And in order to reduce the cognitive load, our brains tend to automate or make habitual everything it possibly can, right? So that we don't have to think about things as we navigate our life, right? So our brains are constantly creating rules of thumb or heuristics or mental models that become our operating system. And the older we get, the more we tend to operate on autopilot, right? We have these deeply embedded beliefs that are influencing our behavior without our awareness. Now, that should keep you all up at night, right? I think it was Carl Jung who said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, right? So that kind of gives us an idea about the nature of how a mindset works. It operates like a self-authoring software program that reaches into the past in order to navigate the future. And that's fine when the future looks like the past. But if you want the future to be different than the past, you've got to sort of recognize that your mindset might not lead you there. You got to be aware of these underlying beliefs. And so one more thing I'll say about the mindset before I move on is think of a mindset as a belief system, right? And it's not the beliefs like the knowledge you learned in school or the things your parents taught you explicitly. It's the beliefs that you've acquired implicitly through your interpretation of your life experiences. It's your underlying assumptions about how the world is and how the world works. And it's also made up of the assumptions that you have about who you are and what you're capable of, right? So it's your deeply held beliefs about the external world and your deeply held beliefs about who you are. And I can say to you, having never met you, with a very high degree of certainty, that in both cases, your beliefs about how the world works and your beliefs about yourself are in some ways inaccurate or out of date, right? So a mindset is a belief system that is perfectly designed to create the outcomes that it's creating. So if you want different outcomes, you got to behave, you got to operate from a different beliefs. So after studying these entrepreneurs for almost 30 years, the core assumption of the entrepreneur is that it's my responsibility to figure out how to make myself useful to other humans. And that by doing so, I can empower myself. This is a simple underlying assumption from which all other entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills arise, right? And I think if you don't hear anything else that I say in this presentation, like this is probably the most important one. Once we realize that we can figure out how to make ourselves useful to other humans. And that by doing so, we empower ourselves. Like, that's the core issue. All right. So now I'm going to jump into these 8 core concepts that I gleaned from the observation and analysis of what I would call the underdog or the everyday entrepreneurs, right? So the first idea here I'll call choice. And what I mean by that is when you talk to an entrepreneur, they'll almost always divulge some sort of a vision. There's something on the horizon that they're trying to accomplish, right? They have some kind of a compelling goal that they're trying to achieve. And, you hear entrepreneurs, they talk about a vision. I have a vision. This is what I'm something in the future I see I'm trying to make happen, right? And so they have a compelling goal. And what I've gleaned from this, what I now understand is that it's the compelling goal that actually elicits the behavior, right? So another way to think about this is what happens to us in the absence of a compelling goal, right? We tend to fritter away our time. We tend to, get caught up in social media. We spend our time on discretionary things or recreation and leisure. And we need recreation and leisure in our lives. I'm not discounting that. But all I'm trying to say here is it's the compelling nature of the goal that pulls the entrepreneur into the future, right? They're choosing their future rather than allowing their circumstances to dictate the ultimate course of their life. I mean, I think that's really the fundamental concept here. It was Viktor Frankl in his famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, in which he said the last of the human freedoms is our ability to choose the way we respond to our circumstances, right? So, a question I would ask you all rhetorically is, do you have a compelling goal? Like something that's pulling you towards the future that you're excited about. Something that draws on all of your intellect and your mental capacities, your faculties. And the second question is, if you don't have a compelling goal, ask yourself, why not? Like, what's standing in the way? So the second observation I wanted to talk about from these unlikely entrepreneurs is their ability to recognize opportunities that most of us overlook, right? And on the surface, this appears to be a mystical ability. And when you dig beneath the surface, it's really quite simple. And again, it stems from this fundamental assumption that it's my responsibility to figure out how to make myself useful to other humans. And the more useful I become, the better off I'm going to be, right? All right. So from this perspective, we look at problems as opportunities, right? And this is really a subtle yet powerful shift that occurs within the mind that most of us are not consciously aware of, right? Look, most of us, just like anybody else, we're trying to get our own needs met. We're trying to pay the bills. We're trying to get our, raise a family and educate our children and so on and so forth. We're trying to get our own needs met. And that's natural. What the entrepreneur realizes is that by solving problems for other people is the way forward. That's the path. We empower ourselves. So they shift their perspective and instead of thinking about how do they get their own needs met, They open the lens, they broaden the aperture of the lens to look more broadly around them and ask themselves, what's missing? What's not working? What's out of date? What can be improved, right? And so that's sort of the cognitive framework that shifts and reorients the brain in a way that activates curiosity and creativity and all of these other essential skills. It's a really simple idea. Problems, frustrations, and unmet needs are potential opportunities, right? That's the fundamental of it. Start looking at every problem, every frustration, every unmet need, and try to think about how you would solve it rather than just complaining about it or moving on. Okay, so the third thing that we see in these entrepreneurs is what I would call a bias towards action, right? They don't spend a lot of time writing business plans and doing formal market research and trying to figure everything out, right? They tend to take a ready, fire, aim approach, right? Now, to the uninitiated, this might look like recklessness or undisciplined enthusiasm. And very often, the people who are trying to help entrepreneurs will try to rein in this bias towards action by encouraging us to write business plans and do extensive market research. And this is usually bad advice. And I'm going to say something kind of controversial, but business planning is actually toxic to the entrepreneurial opportunity discovery process, right? In this case, you have to learn through trial and error. You have to learn through micro experimentation. So think of it like this. You know, most of us have been taught to look before you leap, to plan everything out before you take a single step. That's very prudent advice when the cost of failure is high and the opportunity being pursued is visible and quantifiable. But for the entrepreneur, the opposite circumstances exist, right? They don't have a lot of money to risk. And very often the opportunities they're pursuing are not obvious in the beginning. And so they're able to tease out these latent opportunities through experimentation and adaptation. I like to call this micro experimentation. They're constantly taking small risks and learning from the results, right? So researchers call this effectual reasoning, right? So most of us have been taught causal reasoning, which means you know before you go. You plan it all out and then you do it. And again, that works in circumstances where the cost of failure is high and the opportunity is quantifiable. But for the entrepreneur, you do the opposite. You use effectual reasoning, which is you have to go in order to know, right? And you survive through micro experimentation. That's the secret to discovering hidden opportunities, right? So you think of the entrepreneur as behaving like a detective trying to solve a mystery. You assume that you don't know what people want and need. And this goes back to the importance of a mindset, because people will say they want something or they need something, but when you show it to them, they won't pay for it, right? So, you know, people don't know themselves. We're strangers to ourselves, right? Surveys are, you know, not all that useful. You have to take micro experiments and become like a scientist or a detective who's trying to solve a mystery, right? And he used the detective as a metaphor because it illustrates the idea that you can't really plan when you're trying to solve a mystery. All you can do is look for clues. And that's what entrepreneurs do. Another way to think about this is that think of entrepreneurship as the scientific method. You have a hypothesis that you write down on the back of a napkin, and you figure out how to design and conduct the simplest experiment you can to see if your idea has any merit, right? And you do a little test and you learn from the results and you keep doing that. That's the simple secret hiding in this bias towards action. Another thing that's very easy to observe in underdog entrepreneurs is that they have an unusual sense of curiosity, right? They're always learning. But here's the thing, and you know, they're not necessarily learning through formal means. They're learning through informal and non-formal means, as well as through formal means. And many entrepreneurs, as you know, are not great students, right? And I want to begin this concept here with a very fundamental premise that humans, like all other mammals, are equipped with the innate desire and the capability to learn everything they need to learn in order to adapt and thrive in their environment, right? So let's just start. Just like every other mammal, we have the innate desire and the capability to learn what we need to learn in order to adapt and thrive in our environment, okay? That's kind of the beginning point. I see evidence of this abundantly in my observation of these underdog entrepreneurs. I see hundreds and hundreds of people. I probably, thousands of examples of people of modest intelligence, of modest means, learning and teaching themselves amazing things without the guidance of a formal instructor or outside of any kind of formalized learning structure. So where does this curiosity come from? Now, let's remember that we're all born naturally curious. Like that's how we connect and figure out our environment, right? Curiosity, we learn not to be curious, right? That's been well established in the literature that, if you've ever had children, that a preschooler will ask why not, what if questions 40 or 50 times an hour, which can be quite frustrating for mom and dad. But almost the moment the child shows up in school, they stop asking questions, right? Well, the entrepreneur is driven by curiosity because they innately understand that the more useful they become, the better off they're going to be. And there's no limit to how useful they can become, right? So they're always searching. They're always like observing the way, why are people doing it this way? Why does that happen? Why? That they're constantly learning, but most of their learning is happening through experiments, through their friends, through like informal and non-formal learning methods. So here's another thing that's easy to spot in the entrepreneur. They become very, very resourceful, right? And this is really interesting to me. What it really comes down to is that, so many of us think, well, I want this other life. I want a better life, but I'm stuck because I don't have the money to live this other life. And that thinking is inside out. It's inverse. It's wrong. It's a flawed model of logic. Because you don't have money in many cases because you've never been taught how to make yourself useful without the guidance of another, right? And so once the entrepreneur understands I can make it work with what I have, then they start to learn how to invest rather than spend. And what I mean by that is, let's go back to the word choice, right? When we don't have a compelling goal, when we don't have something that we're striving to achieve, it's very easy to squander whatever discretionary time, money, thought we might have on recreational things, on sports, or hanging out with our friends, or watching television or social media or whatever, right? But once we realize there's something compelling and we can make it happen, we learned how to invest our time, our money, and our resources very, very carefully in order to make it happen. And so that's really the fundamental concept that comes from this observation of these underdog entrepreneurs. They know how to make it work with what they have and figure out how to make yourself useful. And Justin and I were talking about this just before we went live. And you know, I'm forever saying you don't need money to start a business. Well, I mean, you need some money, maybe $100 or $200 or whatever, but you don't need thousands or millions of dollars to become an entrepreneur. You need to figure out how to make yourself useful to other humans. And you need to devote your God-given talent, abilities, and resources focused on that. So the sixth idea here that we observed in entrepreneurs is really around their sense of reliability, or maybe you could call it brand, right? But they understand that, again, this goes back to this underlying idea. It's up to me to figure out how to make myself useful to other people, right? So if you're operating from that assumption, you know that you have to show up every day and do exactly what you said you were going to do, right? You got to fulfill your promises reliably. And that's different from when you're working in a job where someone else is telling you what to do all the time, right? It creates a different dynamic. So, here's another way to think about this. There's 4 different kinds of luck, right? And I want to talk about this. And what's hidden in this reliability is our ability to manufacture luck. And it works like this. So the first kind of luck is what I'll just call dumb luck, right? You're walking down the street, you find some money laying on the sidewalk. Okay, great. That's just random luck. Totally random. That's the first kind of luck. The second kind of luck occurs when you're out talking to people and shaking things up and trying to make things happen, right? You're shaking a tree. That's like what Naval Ravikant calls hustle luck, right? And, that's the experimentation and adaptation. That's the trial and error. Most of it's going wrong, but every once in a while something goes right and you stumble into something, right? And here's what's frustrating. To the outside observer, that just looks like luck. Oh, you got lucky. Yeah, luck is a factor, no doubt. But you got lucky because you were out there shaking the luck tree. You weren't sitting at home waiting for luck to find you, right? So the second kind of luck, we'll just call it hustle luck. The third kind of luck comes when you start to learn about a space that you're observing for a while, and you start to see opportunities that other people can't see, right? And then the fourth kind of luck is really the most important. It's the luck based on your reputation, over time, you have a reputation of being fair, of working well with others, about reliably solving problems. And people come to you with opportunities because of that reliability. And what's lost on the casual observer here is by being reliable, you've now created a luck manufacturing system that opportunities come to you. You said, that's kind of how it works. So number 7, what we see in entrepreneurs, what we've observed is there's this tendency to create intentional support communities, right? And, think about this for a minute. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, it means you're going to deviate from societal norms, from your own behavioral norms, your familial norms. You're going to deviate from the normal course of action. And in these cases, like the people that normally we would turn to for help, our parents, our teachers, they don't know how to help us, right? What we see in entrepreneurs is they tend to reach out to other more successful entrepreneurs. And again, there's a hidden gem here, right? Most of us tend to surround ourselves with people who think and act more or less like we do because it's comfortable. But because we're striving for something that's important to us, that's compelling, we tend to reach outside of our comfort zone and reach out to entrepreneurs who sort of become like Sherpas. They become sort of like what's the word I want here? Sort of like de facto parents that can guide us through this discovery process, right? If you think about an animal in the wild, and that animal is like orphaned, the likelihood that animal is going to perish before it reaches maturity is very, very high, unless that young animal attaches itself to another adult, right, that understands the lay of the land. That's one of the most powerful things we can learn by observing entrepreneurs. Go out and find yourself a mentor, someone who's been through this. Surround yourself with others who are on this journey who can help support you. Okay, last thing. Of course, this makes sense, right? You hear in every entrepreneur story what they say to me over and over and over again: I just refuse to give up. Like that's what so many of the entrepreneurs I've interviewed attribute to their success. I just never gave up, right? So where does this sense of resilience come from, right? Again, let's look beneath the surface. And again, what I've done here is I've observed the behaviors of the entrepreneur, and then I've done the research in behavioral psychology and social psychology to understand why they're behaving this way. And what we find here is that they have a sense of optimism. It's what psychologists call an optimistic explanatory style, right? So an explanatory style is basically a fancy way of saying, is what's the story you're telling yourself in your own mind? And for most of us, that story is so familiar, we don't even know we're telling it to ourselves anymore, right? But it's these underlying beliefs that determine whether or not we will persist. So, for example, when you run into problems or challenges or setbacks, someone with a pessimistic explanatory style will start to tell themselves, this is permanent, this is pervasive, this is personal, right? This always happens to me, right? It's always this way. I'm just stupid. Like there's nothing I can do. Those are the kind of underlying, like the self-talk that causes us to give up. It causes much worse than that. It causes anxiety, it causes depression, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. As opposed to someone who has more of an optimistic explanatory style, which is when they reach a challenge or a setback or some type of adversity, they tell themselves, this is temporary, this is fixable, this is local, this is a small problem, we can figure out a way to get around it, right? Now, what the psychological research tells us is people that have an optimistic explanatory style, in other words, people who learn to optimistically interpret adversity tend to become healthier, happier, and stronger than people who have never suffered adversity in the first place, right? So that's the last thing I want to leave you with is pay attention to the story you're telling yourself, right? One of the entrepreneurs I interviewed became a very, very wealthy inventor he started out selling used clothing while he was in college, and he became a very wealthy inventor. And he said to me, his name is John Osher. You can look him up, Osher. There's a Harvard case study about him. He said, I could answer any 3 questions you could ask me about entrepreneurship. I could answer any questions you could ever ask me about entrepreneurship, and I could answer it with the same 3 words. Find a way. Find a way. Find a way. And he said, look, I know that's not that useful, but it speaks to the attitude, it speaks to the mindset of the entrepreneur. Find a way. So I just want to kind of end this by just reminding you, it comes back to the mindset, right? We can't solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. I mean, that's Einstein's definition of insanity, is trying to do the same things over and over and over again, trying to get different results. So I hope these 8 concepts are useful to you all. And I'm going to stop sharing now. And Justin, if we can maybe open up for Q&A, I'm happy to do that. But anyway, just ending by saying thank you, and I hope that these ideas are useful in some way.
Well, I certainly have learned a ton. I think the idea of making yourself useful to others is the one really key takeaway for entrepreneurial mindset. So I think that's really helpful. One of the questions we had was, is that the same thing as empathy? Do entrepreneurs have to have empathy for others?
Bravo. That's exactly what it is. It's empathy. And like in business school, you'll never hear that word empathy. Right? It's like that. That's like the simple secret in entrepreneurship. It's like you're on this earth to make yourself useful to other humans, and you got to figure out what they need. If you want to read a fantastic book about that, it's written by the late Clayton Christensen. It's called Competing Against Luck. And he does a pretty deep dive into how to tease out not only the functional, but the social and emotional dimension of human needs. It's a great question.
So while we're on the subject of empathy, you said you've interviewed 500 entrepreneurs around the world. Who did you not want the interview to end with? Who was the most sort of interesting to just sit with and talk to? And what are some of the stories of the people that you've talked to that are just really fascinating and interesting?
So I find them all really interesting. I mean, it's there are all these like winding stories, and it never ceases to amaze me. In the last 7 days, I've interviewed 3 different entrepreneurs. One of them from Athens, Greece. Another one from the middle of Kansas, in the United States. And another guy that started a cleaning business with a carpet cleaner he bought with a credit card. And his first job was a $35 job to clean like a carpet in a small store. And they locked him in the store overnight to clean the carpet. He didn't know how to use the machine. Like, it was a disaster. And now he has multi-million-dollar cleaning contracts all over the United States. He has 150 employees. I mean, you know, Justin, I guess I've heard so many of these stories. Maybe the one story I would say that I still keep digging into is the story that I heard 10 years ago from my co-author, Clifton Talbert, about the lessons he learned from his Uncle Cleve at the ice house in Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. But I want to spring that back to you all. I mean, I'm springing that back on you, Justin, because these underdog entrepreneurs are everywhere. You never hear about them in school, right? But they're in every community. They're in rural communities, they're in large communities, they're in the suburbs, they're everywhere. We're just ignoring them.
You know, you and I were talking earlier about you have to be scrappy to be an entrepreneur. And I definitely think you walk into stores, even around here in Baku, and you see people who are scrappy, who are finding an angle. And I think it's definitely a good vision to go for the underdog a little bit. Yeah.
It's just a whole different thing than the big name entrepreneurs. It's just a whole different playing field.
So one of the questions we have is about the business environment. How important is a supportive business environment? What are the sort of, does the government have to set up a framework, or what are the roots that nurture entrepreneurship, and how important should that be to somebody who's considering starting their own business?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm going to answer it I'm going to try to keep my answer simple. I have two messages here. The first message is, look, you've got to figure out how to make yourself more useful to more people in spite of the environment, in spite of. And that's what my first book was about. It was about an African American who came of age in the Mississippi Delta at a time when African Americans didn't have basic rights. And yet he managed to own 5 little businesses, and he managed to have money in the bank, even though he didn't have a formal education or didn't have access to anything. So the first part of my message is, like, you got to find a way to do it in spite of the system. And there are plenty of examples of entrepreneurs who are doing it. And finding yourself, so that's going to go to the second half of my answer. Surround yourself with other people who are on that journey. Like, find your tribe. And that helps create a movement, right? Instead of waiting for the government to give you permission or set up the ecosystem, you have to go and you have to do it in spite of the lack of those things. Now, my message to policymakers, to organizational leaders, and to educators is that, we are grossly underestimating the capability of our students, of our workers, of our citizens, right? And that's what I've seen with my own eyes through my work, is the extraordinary ability of ordinary people. And so I guess what I'm saying, Justin, is that what I'm desperately trying to do here is get out of my head into the minds of as many people as I can. Because if you've seen what I saw, you'd stop watching this webinar right now, and you'd get up out of your chair and you'd go start chasing after an opportunity. Right? I mean, that's really what I'm trying to say in just very simple terms.
So on the business environment question, I guess a related point is, you said you don't need much money, but you might need a little bit. What are some suggestions that you have for sort of pulling together the resources you need to start whatever the business is, whatever your idea is? Not everything can be started with $30. Some things require a little more. How do you go about pulling together the resources?
So that's a big question. I'm gonna try to answer it. So 1987, Justin, I started my first business. I strapped a borrowed ladder on the roof of my car, and I went into a wealthy neighborhood where I'm not from, and I offered to clean the leaves out of people's rain gutters. I didn't know what the word entrepreneur meant. I just didn't want to go back to work for somebody else for some, a mind-numbing job. And I got lucky. I got a customer on my first day. I had enough sense to show up and do what I said I was going to do for the price I agreed to do it. And I kept doing that. And then people saw that I was reliable. They said, hey, can you fix this? Can you fix that? 12 years later, I was doing $5 million in revenue.
So the reliability point you had.
It's a reliability point, but like, the other point is, like, through action, you can uncover opportunities that no amount of planning will unfold. So to be more direct, Justin, I would say, like, reduce your idea. Look, if you want to launch FedEx, you need like 20 Falcon jets to get that started. I mean, there's some businesses you can't bootstrap, but they are few and far between. If you want to open a restaurant, start selling at a market with a hot plate if you have to. Start asking people into your house and to try these different samples, and just reduce it to the smallest experiment you can. And keep always in your mind, I'm a detective. I'm trying to figure out how to do something useful. Justin, here's the thing I want to say. Think of a Venn diagram. Here's the first sphere. You have interests that are unique to you, whoever you are. They're unique to you. They're you. That's it. They came on a hard drive. You didn't get to choose them. And you have abilities that are also unique to you. Okay? Where's the overlap in those two spheres? When you put those two things together, you have authenticity. And right now you got something already, because nobody can compete with you at being you. So you escape competition by being authentic, okay? So what are you interested in? What are you good at? And then the third sphere is, what do other humans need? How do you mash those three things together? That's really what we're looking for in that intersection. Because when you like doing it and when you're good at it, work is no longer work. Right? The lines between work and play become blurred. To the outside observer, like, there's no distinction. And that's how you engage your potential. That's how you create an amazing life.
It's really awesome. One of the questions that I'd alluded to earlier was, and I'm still waiting, by the way, for those that are on this chat with us to come up with some more questions for you. So please, everyone, share questions. Is how important is intellectual property? And what can you do? Do you have to protect your IP? And how important is that to entrepreneurship?
Okay, so Justin, thank you for that question. And I have a slightly different perspective on this. And my observations, when the nascent entrepreneur is overly concerned with intellectual property rights, in most cases, that's the hallmark of an amateur. Right? And so there's a couple ways to think about this. And one way is that, I'll quote Richard Branson, like, the idea is the easy part. Ideas are a dime a dozen. You think you got a great idea, 10,000 other people got the same idea right now. Like, get over yourself, right? Ideas are like trains. You miss this one, there'll be another one along in 20 minutes. Like, it's the execution of the idea that matters. And so That's really the important thing. But let me go back to my Venn diagram: your interest, your ability, and the needs of others, right? If your idea is in those spheres, that's how you're going to eliminate the competition. If you're doing something just because you want to make money, you're operating from the wrong mindset. Like, money is like happiness. You can't pursue it. It must ensue. You're trying to make yourself useful to other humans. And if you figure out how to do that with your interests and abilities, money will happen. But if it's just trying to make money, then you're thinking about yourself again. You're not thinking about other people, right? But the other way to think about the intellectual property question is that, like, I've also come to believe that, like, almost never is an idea obvious at its beginning. And the idea you start with is almost never the idea you end up with. And I see this all the time. Like, people spend thousands of dollars with intellectual property attorneys and trying to get all this right. I've had people work on patents for like 8 years and spend $100,000. They've never talked to a customer. It's insane, right? And the idea won't be obvious. And I've heard people say this: if the idea is obvious at the beginning, it's no good. Because the patent's not going to stop you from competition, right? And I, I have a good friend, an entrepreneur that I interviewed, is a Native American guy that grew up like under a blue tarp. He's one of the United States' most prolific inventors. His name is David Petit. And he'll tell you, like, large company wants your patent, they're going to steamroll right over you. Great, you got a patent for your little idea. That's fine. You got $5 million now to defend it against DuPont or Microsoft or somebody. Good luck with that. Right? So that's kind of how I think about it. There are some cases when you have an idea and you should put some protection around it, but they're really, really rare.
So to be an entrepreneur, you don't have to be an inventor. You
Correct.
They're different skill sets. Where do they overlap between being inventive and entrepreneurship?
I don't know. That's a really interesting question, Justin. I don't know that they even overlap, right? I mean, I think of it like this. You're trying to, like, you're going on this opportunity discovery, like you're going on a journey, like an expedition. And you're trying to figure out what other humans need, and you're trying to figure out if you're the guy that can deliver it. Right? So maybe you want to open up a pizza restaurant. It's already well established that people will pay for pizza. There's no mystery there. That part of the mystery has already been solved. Right? Now the mystery becomes, can you make a pizza better than anybody else? Can you deliver that pizza consistently over and over and over again in a way that's going to lure everybody to your restaurant? Like, that's the mystery you're trying to solve, right? So I just think of it in terms of trying, like, thinking like a detective and trying to figure out what people need.
And shake that luck tree a little more as well.
Yeah.
Making your own luck. I like the image a lot.
It's really interesting. And it's like, all of these concepts that you observe in entrepreneurs, here's, the punchline, if you will, Justin. In psychology, there's a term called the fundamental attribution error. And it's a fancy word, and all it means is that it's the human tendency to overemphasize traits, like personality traits, when trying to explain a person's behavior, while ignoring all of the social, environmental, and situational factors that influence their behavior, right? And So when you look at entrepreneurs, you tend to see these confident, curious, high degree of self-efficacy, and you think, oh, and then you see this in the media all the time. People go out, they're going to interview Justin. Justin borrowed, $1,000 from his mother-in-law 20 years ago. He built this big company, just sold it, or had some big event. A bunch of reporters flock over to Justin and say, how did you do it? They start interviewing you, and what they see is this guy that's really confident, that has all these attributes. And then they go back to their office and they write these stupid pieces about these are the attributes you need to be a successful entrepreneur. And what they fail to recognize is that Justin was like a know-nothing little knock-kneed little chicken when he started on that journey, right? He was like a little barnyard chicken, didn't know what the heck he was doing. He had no confidence, right? So those attributes are actually the effect of the pursuit of a compelling goal rather than the cause. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense to me. We have a last question to bring us home, and that's a question about what sort of resources the United States might offer to entrepreneurs here in Azerbaijan. And I don't know if you've got an answer to that, or I think that you've covered some of it in you're creating your own luck, but what resources can you point to?
I'll tell you what resources. I'm going to tell you how to create your own resources now. I'll tell you probably the most important thing you could do is find one other entrepreneur. Go to a coffee shop, find a friend that's trying to make something happen, and then build a community. Find the entrepreneurial people in your community that are on this journey. Like, that's probably the most impactful thing you can do. The second most impactful thing you can do is read.
We can help with that. Thank you so much, Gary. It's been such a pleasure, and I've taken a lot away. You've really inspired me, and I'm a long-standing 20 years in the government, so I'm inspired now to try something else. So thank you for that, and I'm sure you've inspired all the people who've joined us.
That's great, Justin. I appreciate the opportunity. I always enjoy sharing these ideas with people because I see that. I mean, people are, hungry for these ideas. Not everyone wants to start a business, but we all want to be engaged in work that matters. We all want to be striving towards growth and meaning and prosperity in our lives, right? The entrepreneurial spirit is the human spirit. It ain't just in some of us, it's in every single one of us. So you just validated that for me, Justin. Thank you.
I think you're exactly right. So thank you.
Let me echo Justin's thanks. Gary, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your vision of the attributes that make an entrepreneur, indeed a successful entrepreneur. We're going to continue this discussion on Thursday at the exact same time at 7:00 with Azerbaijan's probably preeminent entrepreneur, Farid Ismailzadeh, who's going to talk about look at the same question but through a very local prism, talking about some of the paths that the Azerbaijani entrepreneur can take. So I invite everybody, including you, Justin, including you, Gary, to join us at the Baku American Center Facebook page Thursday, May 21st at 5:00. It's going to be an excellent discussion, as indeed was this. For a different topic on the day before at 5:00 on May 20th. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a session with the State Department's regional medical officer talking about family strategies for coping in this very stressful time of quarantine and COVID-19. So please join us again at the Baku American Center Facebook page. But for now, Justin, Gary, thank you both so much for joining us. This has been wonderful. And thank everybody for
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks to everybody who watched and asked questions. They were excellent. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.